Again, lively questions, Bart, while still skirting the issues that I raised with you, but that seems to be the way we're doing this tonight. We don't have hard evidence that you're asking for. That's what we both agree on. We do not have the hard evidence, but we have a great deal of soft evidence that, in all probability, leads to the conviction that what we have in our hands is, in all essential respects, what the New Testament writers actually wrote. I could illustrate it this way. Bart keeps talking about these early scribes that made mistakes left and right, and we have no idea if they were accurate copies or not. Well, let's just suppose I took 20 of you, and we met in a room, and I read out to you the text of the Gospel of Mark. Many of you would make some very egregious errors. All of you would make mistakes. How in the world could anybody get back to the text that I read to you? Well, that's what Bart and I both know very well how to do. It's known as textual criticism. We examine these manuscripts. We can compare the manuscripts so that we can see this reading came from this. It's an errant reading that was due to this kind of mistake. We can compare the manuscripts in terms of which ones are sloppier, which ones tend to be more accurate, and the basis that they have. We can do it through several generations of copies. In fact, I do an exercise that I've done now 70 times in churches all over the country and, in fact, in the world. It's called The Gospel According to Snoopy. I wanted to use a mild name so that we could play it pretty well. We get 50 people, 22 of whom are scribes. I give them a passage to copy out in English, and each scribe has instructions. One scribe has the instructions, you're making theological changes. Another one, you have bad hearing and you're hearing this in the scriptorium. Another one, you're a terrible speller. Another one, you have no idea how to write so that anybody could even read what you're saying. I have done this exercise 70 times over the last 35 years with lay people, with people who know nothing about textual criticism except what I tell them the hour on Friday night when we begin. The scribes copy out the text. Saturday morning, everybody else comes together, and on the basis of thinking through the issues of the external evidence and the internal evidence and the relationships that these scribes have to each other, with the earliest manuscripts all gone, they work through that to try to get back to the original wording of the Gospel according to Snoopy. Over the years, almost every single time we've done this, there have been no more than 1 or 2 mistakes. There has never been a serious change in the text, something like to versus also, those kinds of changes. These are people who don't know anything about textual criticism. They have the same kind of a situation that New Testament scholars are facing, and we are trying to put this together on the basis of probability. I give them an hour instruction on Friday night, and then I let them decide how to go about getting back to the original with no instruction. They have to do it on their own. And they debate in groups, they get back together. It's about a 4 or 5 hour project. Over a dozen times they have exactly duplicated the wording of the original text. The worst group I ever had was Dallas Seminary doctoral students, but I don't want to talk about them. I think they missed it by 4 words. Bart, you talk about the worst scribes. And you say it's the earliest scribes that are the worst. And the way you can tell is because you can compare them to an 11th century scribe that's very accurate. I don't think that you're trying to say, in fact, I know you're not trying to say, that the text of the 11th century manuscript, which is almost surely going to be Byzantine, is better than the early Alexandrian manuscripts. What you're trying to say, I think, is that these manuscripts that you consider to be the worst manuscripts are that they are not done by professional scribes, and consequently, they have mistakes in them. But even then, I have to ask, what manuscripts are you talking about? I don't think it's the 2nd century manuscripts. We have 4 fragments of the book of Acts and elsewhere in Western manuscripts in the 3rd century. We have part of a gospel in the late 4th century that has the Western text, and then we have a Gospels manuscript in the 5th century that's Western. That would be the wild copying texts. But the Alexandrian manuscripts do not greatly differ from one another, as you suggest, except in those incidental errors. My evidence for this is Dr. Tim Finney's doctoral dissertation on Hebrews. He's from Perth, Australia, and he demonstrated that the early manuscripts have incidental errors for the book of Hebrews. And Barbara Allon, the former director of the Institute for Neue Testamentliche Textforschung in Münster, the flagship Institute for Text Critical Studies, recently wrote an article in which she looked at the early manuscripts for John, and she said they really are very similar to each other, except for the kinds of mistakes that we can determine what's going on. I think that you're trying to suggest, Bart, that out of chaos we get this order, when the chaos actually of all these manuscripts we possibly could start with would only end up in us having variants where we could get back to the original just exactly as we do today. Thank you.